Hi, this is Scott Klug, and this is a special edition of our podcast, Lost in the Middle. Well, with the election behind us, my reporting on the lost political middle is going to taper off a bit. But before Washington turns to battles over cabinet selections and wonkish policy debates, read pretty boring from my perspective, I joined forces with two other political podcast buddies to give the election our own twisted post-mortem. Justin Young's a professional comedian and the host of a podcast, Politics, Politics, Politics. Justin's loved politics since the year 2000 when he watched his high school teacher in Florida count pieces of ripped paper to determine who would be the leader of the free world, only in America. If you want to gear up for the 28 election, he has a wildly successful card game called The Contender to prep for the next presidential debate. Meanwhile, our Lost in the Middle guest, Andrew Heaton, is the driving force behind his show, The Political Orphanage. He's an independent with libertarian instincts, and we are a tiny echo chamber of two. He's the best-selling author of Laughter is Better Than Communism, as well as two very funny novels. He once opened up for famous actor William Shatner, who said, he's very, very funny. So there. He hosted our discussion, and sadly, we'll find that Justin had to bow out after the first half hour. Here's our conversation.
I am joined today by Justin Robert Young, good friend of mine and host of Politics, 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 as well as host of We're Not Wrong, a show in which I am a regular pundit. And we are joined by Scott Klug. Scott is me from the future. He's much more successful than me, a little bit more handsome, slightly less funny, but has an eerie similarity in his politics, which continues to baffle me. Hello, Scott. Good to see you.
Yeah, good afternoon, guys.
Yeah, and Heaton, you're not a regular
Scott,
pundit on We're Not Wrong. You're a co-host. It's your show, too.
Thank you. That is what I meant to say. My brain is so scattered right now, Justin. Please don't read into that. I can never keep host and co-host straight. I can never remember what the proper designation is. Okay. Scott, you had initially wanted to convene our minds to discuss the election breakdown, and so I'm going to kick it to you. What do you think happened? What is your read on the election?
Well, a couple of sort of notes from 20,000 feet, and I'll let you guys jump in. You know, until this election, there was only one U.S. senator, lonely Susan Collins, tucked up there in Maine, who got elected as a senator of one party while the president of another party, Joe Biden, won her reelection in 2020. This time out, there's a wide swath of them. So in Michigan, in Wisconsin, in it looks like Arizona and Nevada, it doesn't happen very often. If you talk to political scientists lots of times, they sort of laugh at ticket splitting as like this old quaint custom from the 1950s. But if you back up 2 years now, in 2022, it happened all over the place. It happened in Georgia with a Republican governor, a Democratic senator. It happened in Maine with a in Vermont with a Republican governor, a Democratic senator. It happened in Kansas, for God's sakes, and it happens in Wisconsin because it always happens in Wisconsin. But I thought that was the real interesting takeaways from the election, just because I think all of us were trying to guess what would happen. I think the consensus and my guess was the Republicans would win the Senate. It looks like they're going to hold the House, which is a surprise to me. And I think Trump was a jump ball from the beginning. It was really hard. But I thought when I saw her lose North Carolina as badly as she did, that the Harris campaign was going to be in for a long night.
Yeah, I would say probably even if you wanted to get really degenerate with it, like I was, it was Duval County in Florida. As soon as you saw Duval County, which is Jacksonville, which actually had a big special election that a Democrat won in an off year, that was a gigantic sign that this was looking more like the Florida from 2022, which unfortunately for the Republicans did not precipitate a red wave. But if Duval's flipping like that, then that means that Georgia was probably flipping. And if Georgia was probably flipping, then that meant for sure North Carolina was flipping, because that is a little bit more red than Georgia. I think my biggest takeaway is Donald Trump's popular. And that's probably the biggest thing. It sounds stupid to say it now, but the Democrats didn't run a campaign that was indicative of them running against a popular candidate. They ran a campaign that was indicative of them running against somebody that everybody knew was really awful. They just needed it explained to them one more time. Where all those ticket splitters that Scott pointed out, All of them in the final months were running. We worked with President Trump to bring jobs back to Michigan or back to Wisconsin. Even Ruben Gallego, was brought in because Kyrsten Sinema wasn't progressive enough, that she was defending the filibuster and standing in the way of true progress. So the Democrats effectively chased out somebody who was an incumbent that would have gotten reelected with probably $0 put to her if she was running against Carrie Lake. Instead, they put in a progressive who then has to pretend that he's a border hawk, and Chuck Schumer has to spend tens of millions of dollars to convince the public of Arizona to do it. And we still, at least as we are talking right now, don't have an AP call. Ruben Gallego will be that senator, but still mathematically right now on Monday, Senator Carrie Lake is in play. That wouldn't have been the case if Kyrsten Sinema were still there.
Yeah. I'm curious to both of you, what are your takeaways for the Democrats? And Scott, would you consider yourself a never Trumper or a Republican in exile? Is there some label that you care to hoist a banner on?
Well, I would say philosophically, I'm a libertarian Republican. I'm not a fan of the government. I wish more of it would go away. I'm moderate on social issues, so I'm sort of a never Trump guy. Never voted for him, likely never will if he tries to run for a third time, which could be an interesting story. But I think that don't rule it out. The lesson for the Democrats, I think I buy into the theory that they really got clobbered by the woke stuff and by the economy. I think if you're a construction worker in Michigan, where they're trying to ban electrical vehicles, which is the company you work for or the companies who your company does business with, and then sort of wrapped around all of this sort of smug righteousness, I think that's what cost them the election. And it's, I thought it was hysterical that there was a panic at the Washington Post because they didn't issue their editorial and that Bezos intervened. Now, it would have been a story, I think, had Bezos said endorse Trump, but he didn't. He just said, we're not going to do this. And the Post went apoplectic. They've never endorsed a Republican. And trust me, nobody in battleground Wisconsin was waking up one morning, oh my God, thinking, what will the Washington Post do? And I think that's the same problem the Democrats had.
Well, no, that's true, Scott, because they were all waiting for Taylor Swift's event with Kamala Harris, which has been something that has gotten, she only endorsed. It was only an Instagram thing. She didn't show up at the Eras Tour, and that's that has brought fascism to America.
I believe it is mostly economic that happened. I think that there's a touch of the wokeness, but I think it's overplayed. There was an advertisement that was running in battleground states.
You're in show business, so of course you think it's not played up enough.
The ad that I saw that I actually thought was a brilliant ad, it went, Kamala Harris cares about they, them, Donald Trump cares about you, which I thought was actually a brilliant ad, highlighting there's this sort of abstract, borderline theological phenomenon going on that the Democrats are paying attention to. This guy cares about the price of butter. I think that was a very smart play. I do think it was mostly economic, and that I've basically had two different polling groups within the Heaton chicken shit index that I've used to tabulate where I thought the election was going to go, and that includes people who work in media and politics and people who don't work in media and politics. And so within the Trumposphere of people that voted for Trump, I'm going to discount people that work in media and politics, as I do not think that we or they are really emblematic of the overall population. So when I spoke to just people in Oklahoma, people in Texas, Uber drivers, folks at various events I would go to, almost all variations of why are you voting for Trump were basically eggs cost a lot and I feel Democrats are mean to me. That was pretty much it. That was the takeaway that I had repeatedly. And what I find interesting about this is it seems to me that about half the Democrats are aware of this, and all of the interactions that I've had and in the online publications that I'm reading, about half are going, look, we really have to figure out a way to meet people in the middle in the bell curve distribution of what they care about, which appears to be bread and butter issues. And the other half is going, oh, hamburgers cost a lot, so fascism, well done. And I'm going, oh my God, you've learned nothing. You've learned absolutely nothing.
Well, and I think, if you look at the demographic split, I think it's pretty interesting as the Democratic base, to a large degree, aside from black women who are still the most loyal coalition of anyone, it's largely you could argue affluent suburban and city voters, the city voters who live in 48-story condo buildings, not the city city dwellers like my son in LA who lives in a studio apartment, which is smaller than the Gemini space capsule floating through space right now. But I think that for them, it didn't make a difference, right? I think they find it hard to believe that there are families somewhere who say, we can't go to Disney this year. We can only go to McDonald's once a week, not twice a week. I mean, it's real arithmetic if you don't make very much money. And I think especially for a lot of folks who worked in construction, and I know you can put up all the fancy economic indicators and all of that, but for them, when they looked in their wallet, it was a different experience than it was 8 years ago.
And I would say even further than that, Scott, that it's not just a different experience, it's a ritual humiliation. And you wonder why the inflation has a historical legacy that was reaffirmed last Tuesday of killing presidencies dead. It's exactly that. If you have the same job that you had, and so let's say, unemployment has been where it's at, which has not, significantly risen. And so that was something that people pointed at. But that's even worse in certain cases, because let's say you got the same job and you make under $100,000 and all of a sudden you're poorer. You didn't do anything different. Everything stayed exactly the same. You were still working the same hours that you were working. You're just older and poorer, and you blame somebody for that. That is just simply how it happens. And there really, really was a disconnect in my life, which is largely either a bunch of upper middle class millennials who are at the peak of our vibrancy and earning potential and, driving around in our Teslas saying, I don't know, I think the economy's good. Because for us, inflation is every once in a while coming out of the Whole Foods and saying, gee, that's a high number. Like it's not something that is every time you go and you have to look at your kids in the face and say, no, we're getting the bag of cereal as opposed to the Lucky Charms. And now I have to deal with a screaming toddler because they don't know the difference of what, a broken supply chain is. And then it doesn't bring you any comfort when the White House continually gaslit America throughout this and continually said, well, this is just
one
transitory.
time other than economics or the senility of the president. Other than those two factors, name one time.
And look, you can lie about the president not having his marbles. Reagan got away with it mostly, but you can as long as the economy's good. Everybody's got to feel good about the economy. They got to feel good about how things are going. And they weren't. It was transitory. Then it was Putin's price hike. And then eventually the only time that they ever acknowledged it was to say, well, it's coming down now. It's doing pretty good now. There was never I feel your pain moment.
I will add, would say they would say inflation's going down, by which they mean the rate of inflation is going down. That's not the same thing as inflation. So it's gone. Inflation's increased by 10% over the last year and a half. Your money's gone. It's gone. It's not coming back. It's not that the prices are going to go back down. It's that the rate of acceleration is slowing down, which is a meaningful distinction for people. Like, I'm a semi-successful comedian. I've had to work very hard to save what little money I have, and I am the Warren Buffett of comedians, given that I have any savings at all. And watching 10% of that just evaporate was like, oh well, that's fun. That's it continued. I want to flip it on the other side though. Scott, I'm descended from Barry Goldwater Republicans, and that's the household in which I was raised. The never Trumpers, Republicans in exile, whatever we want to call them, that I have met have either reconciled to Trump and gone, maybe I overplayed this and he's rough, but I can get behind him, or alternately they are sitting Shiva for the party and the death of the party. I think at this point it's difficult to say that Trump is a transitory blip and that we will go back to Mitt Romney Jr. 4 years from now. Do you re-register as a Democrat? Do you restart the Whig Party? What do you do?
So I think he's a unique figure, right? This is if you're sitting in central Minnesota trying to figure out how the hell did Jesse Ventura get elected as a professional wrestler, and I think that's part of what will happen. It will return to normalcy, but I think whatever happens 4 years from now, whoever the Republican nominee is, the morning they wake up, it's not the party that elected George W. Bush. It's not the party that didn't vote particularly well for Ryan and for Romney when they ran. It's much more blue collar. It's much more rural. I think in many ways it's much more evangelical than it was, which is a strange phrase to use in concert with Donald Trump's personal habits. But I don't think you're going to be able to go back. I don't know that those suburbs will flip. And I think the danger for the Republicans, if they go, oh, well, we got to recapture the wow counties around Milwaukee, which is the Republican base for the last 20 years, which largely drifted away from national Republican politics because of Trump. I think for every vote you pick up in the suburbs, if you don't handle this well, you're going to lose 3 votes in the small towns. And so I think it'll be interesting to see how the parties recalibrate, right? Because the Republicans will have to react to whatever the Democrats do and vice versa. And they're going to have to react to the way the economy is. And Justin's absolutely right. I mean, 2 years from now, if the economy is soaring, the Republicans will add seats in the Senate and continue to hold on to the House. And if we have a huge burp as Trump puts, tariffs on things, tariffs are just a hidden tax on people, right? And so the idea that we're going to rebuild the U.S. industrial base so we can manufacture television sets here is crazy. People are going to be paying $3,000 for a TV rather than $700. So I think 2 years from now, the challenge for the Republicans will be the folks who want to sort of ratchet the clock back. They're not going to be there. In the same way that if I'm a Democrat, I got to figure out how the hell I'm going to capture union workers, not the union organizers, because they're professional Democrats. That's the name of the game. But if you're a steward in a GM plant, assuming GM's still around 3 or 4 years from now, then you're going to wonder where are your members? Because in this situation, a lot of union workers flip to Trump.
Yeah, I read an interesting study in the last few days where they were doing polling of do you identify as working class or not? And in this particular study, and I forget the organization that did it, 75% of the people that self-identified as working class also identified as conservative. And there seems to be this kind of rhetorical flip that's happened in the same way that for Republicans, the Republican Party will always be the party of Lincoln. And black people may or may not agree with that might be a rhetoric that should have been retired at some point. People's mileage will vary, but it's a kind of hagiography that accompanies the Republican Party. The Democrats believe they are always the party of labor. They are always the working class party, and they are the managerial party. And so there does seem to be this disconnect that's happened there.
Well, they feel that they're the working class party because that's what the people in the cities want to believe they are. The people in the cities, every liberal in the city who wants to unionize their Starbucks and has no concept of how or why a union works, it's just a cool thing that they want to say because they read a few posts on Mother Jones. That's the brand, right? But it doesn't really speak to exactly what that party has been. Now, they certainly still have good relationship with leaderships in unions, but it is what it is. I want to go back to something that you mentioned, though, Heaton, that you are descendant of Barry Goldwater. And I really think that Barry Goldwater is somebody that I've thought a lot about over the last few days because it's unquestioned now that Donald Trump is the Ronald Reagan of this modern era. And the way that Reagan swept out an entire generation of conservative leadership and installed his own. And part of the reason why I think of Goldwater is that considering where the Republican Party wound up going, which is a lot closer to where when Goldwater ran in 1964, he was looked at as an absolute crazy person, and he was marketed as such by the Johnson campaign.
A literal crazy person. That's why we have the Goldwater rule. Because
exactly,
the American Psychiatric Association had like 50 people go, oh, yes, I've read several articles that he's clearly a narcissist.
By the way, I believe published in Truth magazine, which is the other funny part about that. But it's like he is not remembered in the same way because he got run over by Ronald Reagan in the same way that a generation of people are going to be thought of differently because they got run over by Donald Trump. This is his party. The question is, will the successful Republican politicians look to pick up his coalition, or will they try to go back into the past and find it? I think on smaller races, House races, you're going to be able to do it. When you're talking about statewide races, this is now Trump's coalition. You're going to have to go to those steak fries. You're going to have to go to those union halls. It ain't going to be all country club anymore. Those days are gone.
Yeah, agree 1,000%. Now, let me ask you the more important question. Is this good for comedy or bad for comedy?
It's not good for my comedy. I will tell you why.
SNL made jokes. SNL made a joke in their cold open. It was an actual joke with a concept, Heaton. I don't know if you saw it.
That's really good. No, I'm glad to hear that. There were the phenomena that happened during the Trump years that was bad for comedy is that twofold. There were a significant amount of comedians that felt a moral obligation to say, but we need to be serious for a moment, constantly. And on top of that, Trump was, I think, for a very long time, a difficult figure to come up with a comedic angle around, simply because a really good tool within political satire is exaggeration. And if Donald Trump comes out and he's literally using the disembodied skull of Don Rickles as a puppet to make fun of Guam and then throws it away. Like we're already starting at an 11 out of 10. I don't know where to take it from here. So that was a functional problem with it. The other problem that was just insufferable and so irritating was there was just a massive amount of clapter that came into the comedy ecosystem during the Trump years where frankly, a lot of subpar comedians or non-comedians would wander into an open mic and then just give their political hot takes on Trump, and everybody felt obligated to clap for them because they weren't talented enough to get laughs. So there was a lot of that going on. I'll say on my end, I have just began working for Reason, and my plan is to make fun of whoever's in power, as I usually do, and really just make fun of wherever I think I can stash in a joke. There's a decent amount of people that are on the libertarian side of things that really just want to make fun of Democrats. So if I spend my time making fun of Trump because he's the president, from where I'm at, I don't know that it will necessarily be as popular as if Kamala were in power. Like, weirdly, I, as an oppositional figure to a Democrat, will probably be better for my comedy and brand than me being an oppositional figure to a Republican. But that's fairly niche. Overall, though, I think if canary in the coal mine, Justin, if Saturday Night Live no longer thinks that they will abet fascism unless they have a sad woman play piano at the beginning of sketches, that's a good sign.
Yeah, I thought the thing that they did was had the cast come out as themselves and talk about how much they love Donald Trump and they all voted for him just so they could stay off the enemies list. And it's like for a liberal institution, at least it had a concept.
Yeah.
And it had a joke, and the punchlines were funny. Like it was slapdash, but I thought it was meaningful, a meaningful step in the right direction. I think that the dark days of comedy, where comedic heroes like Stephen Colbert result to puerile and backwards homophobic jokes that would be, something that you would yell at your kid for saying on the playground, simply because it hurts old Donnie Trump's feelings, are over. And I think that the world is better for it.
I'll add to that just over the last few days, hanging out with lots of people that voted for Kamala Harris, and myself for that matter, my feelings this election are very different than my feelings in 2016. In 2016, I, who was working at Fox Business at the time, was apoplectic that Trump won. Like on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being, oh, I wish I'd got vanilla instead of chocolate, but I couldn't care less. 10 being Emperor Palpatine has destroyed the Senate and we have to go into hiding on Tatooine at this exact moment. I was like a 7 maybe in 2016. And now in 2024, I'm like a 4. I am bothered by this. I don't think it's a good direction for the country, but I'm not frightened. And and this kind of happened in 2016 where I was very freaked out the night of. And then 2 days later, I started getting messages from my friends where they went, we need to start putting lists together of who can hide our Jewish friends. And I went, 1, I don't think we're at the point where we need to worry about the Jews being rounded up. Secondly, if we were, we shouldn't put their name on a list that could be intercepted by authorities. It's just really bad planning on your part. And I've found that this time around, the amount of friends that I have that are in that DEFCON 10, we're all going to die, we have to flee right now, that is much, much smaller. It's closer to glum and frustration than it is to existential angst, which is what it was in 2016. And the fact that fewer people have that means more people will be amenable to laughing, which means that comedy will do better.
It's interesting to me that if you look at a lot of the energy in the Harris campaign, a lot of it was aimed at Trump is a fascist. It's the end of democracy as we know it. And if you looked at polling, it really didn't show up very high on most people's lists. And the only place it seemed to really show up was largely in Democratic priorities. I think that just landed like a thud everywhere in the country because I think people know he's weird, but I don't think anybody thinks, the stormtroopers are going to be marching down Pennsylvania Avenue in the near future. It's just we're all going to have to live with Trump's weirdness and the fact that he's like a jazz sax player. I mean, when he plays on Thursday, he doesn't remember on Friday, which I think explains a lot of the rallies because he just riffs at stuff. But I thought that was so overplayed, and it played into the whole Washington Post thing. That, look, I went to Northwestern's journalism school. I'm still on the board. The podcast I did was sort of old-fashioned journalism. But really, democracy dies in darkness. I mean, how friggin' smug can you be? And clearly, it didn't die.
Well, here's the other.
Sorry,
and that's the other thing is that Jeff Bezos spiked that editorial or that endorsement because he lost $100 million on the Post. Like, that's a lot of money. And Jeff Bezos didn't buy the Post to make cash. He bought it to wield influence. But if he sees the influence dwindling and $100 million price tag per year, then he's probably going to do a few things. And that's exactly what he's done so far. I wonder whether or not they're going to rebrand and bring in a more even-keeled journalistic sensibility. I graduated from the rival journalism school of the Northwestern elite here in the Syracuse Newhouse School, but certainly the way that I was brought up was to have some level of I think editorial judgment, and that's really where I've seen in the Trump years, to finally bring this back to journalism, as me and Scott have been desperately wanting to do, is really just not even necessarily on the reporter level. It's been a lot of the assignment editor level stuff where the things that are going out there and the little rejoinders, if you've written newspaper, then you know where the article is being written by the editor and not by the reporter, because it has this very simple flow to it. And then there'll just be these random paragraphs thrown in that are like explainers of other stuff. And that's really what I've seen. And I hope that what we get going forward, for the benefit of everybody, for the record, not only I think both parties, because they're not going to hide their weaknesses anymore, but also for the public, is just something that that doesn't take campaign rhetoric absolutely seriously and doesn't bring things to such a hyperbolic level that you can have a major party say this is fascism. Well, no, within 2 months, they're weird and serious people. Aren't we super cool? Just ignore him, gals, to he's a fascist. His friend called him a Nazi, and we were pretty sure he's Hitler. Just go ahead and scratch the makeup off.
I agree with the whole he's more of a jazz musician. Like someone, I was talking to somebody in my family who's on the apoplectic side, and she went, he's a fan of Hitler, that he reads from Mein Kampf regularly. Yeah, and my response to that was, I do not think he's read anything without nipples in it since 1980. I think there's I don't believe he's a reader, including fascist literature. And also, I'll digress on that. I think the whole fascist angle was a giant misstep for the Democrats. Like, that really ought to be a card you play once per lifetime, and you really mean it for real. And it was difficult for the Democrats to simultaneously, and Biden did this multiple times, be asked, do you think Donald Trump is an existential threat to the Republic? And for Biden to go, well, no, I don't think he's an existential threat to the Republic. But then later to say he's a fascist. Like, there was this kind of seesaw effect that made me go, well, I don't think you really believe this then. I think that you've used this as a tactic with which to disqualify somebody rather than tangle with them. And I that happens in politics a lot, but I feel like the Democrats have been leaning into that a lot the last 10 years of I can figure out a way to say that you're racist, and now we don't have to talk about this anymore. And I think that whole strategy of how do I figure out how to disqualify your position rather than out-argue your position has exhausted significant swaths of the country who all rolled their eyes at the fascist thing.
The one thing I think I would like to say as the card carrying Republican on the podcast, even if I keep it hidden in my wallet these days, is that I thought Harris actually had an impossible task, right? So she essentially came in with a deeply unpopular administration where the right track, wrong track was like 3-1 against right track. And then she had to do this dance where she had a hard time saying how she was different than Biden for fear that she'd make the Biden loyalists mad. Or if she didn't say it, which is the tactic she took, people will say, well, what the hell? What were you doing there for 4 years? If you didn't like anything he was doing, why didn't you say something? So I think that was a really hard path to win an election. I think it was just interesting the last month how much everybody, the pollsters and everybody else kept trying to downplay the economic hangover from the Biden years. When if you look, from Bill Clinton, George H. Bush through, why other folks lose elections, it's always the economy. And that's the bottom line. And it was interesting that everybody was in a denial about it. And I think had to try to make some really bizarre arguments to make it a more competitive race.
Well, and on top of that, too, I just can't stress what a perpetually toxic position it is to take the position that half the country voted for a man because they're racist, sexist, or are just blatantly okay with racism and sexism. So I just got back from a conference, and if I sound hoarse, that's why, because we were doing a sing-along last night. A guy had a piano. And at said conference, there was a breakout dinner, and I don't think anybody in the dinner, there was maybe 10 of us, I don't think anybody voted for Donald Trump, but we were discussing why did Trump win. And we were getting into this sort of weird argument because, again, nobody here is litigating that Trump should have won. But within the parameters of the argument, and basically the never Trumpers and that wing were going, look, it's the economy. And the other wing of the argument, no, they went, make America great again is make America white again. That's what the election was about. And I was going, I think you're wrong. I think it is a horrible idea for you to tell somebody that voted for Trump, I can see through your lying heart. You might think it's because inflation is high, but deep down it's because you're a bigot, is the worst possible strategy to get those people to come around and vote for you in the future. I think that I can have a conversation with somebody that voted for Trump and go, I think you're dead wrong about protectionism. I think you're dead wrong about tariffs. Let's talk about this, and I'll explain my position, and I hope you come around to my... That's very different than I think you're evil deep down. And I don't think all the Democrats are doing it, but the Democrats that are taking that position of this is ultimately just some kind of bigotry and maintaining power over minority groups, I think that is a horrible strategy. And if they press it too hard, they'll just keep losing elections.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, if you look at the Hispanic vote numbers, it's pretty startling how hard they moved. And especially the Hispanic votes on the Texas southwestern border, how hard the Hispanics moved right. It's also a cultural issue with the Hispanics, right? A lot of evangelicals and a lot of Catholics. And I think part of that woke stuff, however you want to define it, however you're bothered by it or outraged by it, I think that pushes a lot of people away. I remember when I had a buddy in Wisconsin who was involved in a lot of the focus groups on the national level. And this was probably 5 weeks out from the election. And he said, it's really moving numbers. And it's like the economy, the border, everything's. And it was the transgender stuff they saw in the focus groups. It was through the roof. And so in Wisconsin, that had to be a huge line of attack for the last 5 or 6 weeks. And I think we'll look back at it in some ways like the Willie Horton ad, where it just sent all kinds of messages and hit a spot that I don't think the Harris campaign ever saw coming. As I read, sort of the section now of the body on the autopsy table, I think there's a lot of Democrats who are warning the Harris campaign she had to respond, and she chose not to do it. And that was a huge mistake.
Yeah, I think that there's an element in the Democratic Party. I like the Jared Polis neoliberal wing of the Democratic Party. That's the group that can tell you what comparative advantage is. I feel very comfortable with. I like that side of the Democratic Party. And I don't think that they did a terribly good job of really explaining economic boons that were happening or would get better or why it would get worse under Trump. I felt that I understand why people voted for Trump for inflation, which I don't think was a good idea. I don't think tariffs are going to help at all. But you have Biden initially saying basically there is no inflation, and then it's transitory, and then just saying, well, corporations got greedy, which I think most people go, I already thought they were greedy. I don't think they became any more greedy. That seems like a weird factor there. So you have that guy, and then you have the other guy going, you're getting robbed blind by a bunch of chodes in the swamp. like that guy at least is responding to what you're talking about. I don't think he'll be the one to solve it, but I understand why people went, well, that guy seems to acknowledge the problem, so I'm going to go that direction. The wing of the Democratic Party, which I think is not helping, is the identitarian part, the identitarian wing that wants to every generation have a new civil rights movement with which to walk up a hill and be heroic. And I see a lot of that with the transgender issues. And while I very much appreciate the impulse to fight tyranny and bigotry wherever it should rear its head, always having a giant banner under which, this is our moment to be Martin Luther King Jr., I think can be misplaced and was misplaced here. Tuesday night when we were doing the election coverage, which you were nice enough to join for, Scott. Thank you for that. Justin and I were doing the show. I reiterated, maybe this will be the last time. Folks, this is the very last time I'm ever going to say I didn't vote for Donald Trump. I don't like Donald Trump. I'm just not going to say it moving forward because I'm very tired of saying this. But I didn't vote for Trump. I wasn't pleased with the outcome. The night that we were doing the election coverage, I was cracking a lot of jokes because I'm a comedian. It's my job to do that. I'm also aware that a lot of people are bummed out. And so I felt I had a moral obligation to be funny all the time. And I got a message where somebody was watching me and Justin, and they went, I'm glad you unthreatened straight white men think this is funny. And I read that and went, are you trying to make me vote for Donald Trump? Like, I feel like the Democratic Party should send me a citation at this point for not becoming a Trumper for that kind of crap. And yeah, that whole element of whatever that is, I think was caustic to the Democratic cause this election.
Well, yeah, and I think if you look at the I'm sorry.
Oh, I was going to say you touched on the polls, and I'm curious as to your thoughts on the polls, how efficacious they were. Is this a situation where, well, I was about to say, is it so tight that it was all within the margin of error and no one could see it coming? But I don't feel like it ended up being that tight. It ended up being much more pro-Trump than we thought it was going to be. It wasn't the 50-50 razor-thin analysis that everybody assumed, including myself, going into it. So were the polls wrong? Is there something systemically wrong with the polls? I know Ann Seltzer had Iowa going blue. What happened there?
Well, she has to write a whole book to explain what happened because her poll was an outlier. I mean, I don't know what Trump ended up winning Iowa by 7 or 8 points, I think. Yeah, so this was a strange poll for your folks who aren't political junkies listening, where suddenly out of the blue they announced that Harris was up 4 points in Iowa, like the weekend before the election. It just didn't ring true to me. I think the pollsters are in a hard place, right? It used to be back in the day when I ran for office, people would just call landlines. Imagine that. They have those things in the Smithsonian if you've never seen one. I actually have one because it comes with my internet and comes with my cable service, which also makes me a dinosaur if I still have cable. But now it's so hard. I mean, you've got to try to reach folks on mobile phones. You have to text them. Do they respond? How do you figure out what the age and demographic breakdown is? And then since, you'll know this from your time in the UK, they were completely wrong on Brexit. They had the Scottish independence vote upside down. And even in the vote this spring in the UK for the new prime minister, they did not see the sort of vote and supports that the Reform Party and the Liberal Democrats would get. So the polls, as much as they tried to change them in the UK, they were still wrong 5 months ago. And but I think in the longer trend line, and it was interesting because I have lots of friends. I live in Madison, Wisconsin, right? Tons of Democrats. A lot of buddies of mine are nominal Republicans, but just couldn't vote for Trump. But if you looked at those battleground Senate races, right, in the spring before Biden stepped aside, Sherrod Brown in Ohio and Casey in Pennsylvania and Tammy Baldwin in Wisconsin were 8-9 points better than Biden was doing. And then when Harris got into it, she hung on to most of that. It was still 6 or 7. The polling in Tammy Baldwin's race in Wisconsin was 8 points in August. And then, boom, in a finger snap, they all collapsed and they were a jump ball, right? Pennsylvania was tied. There was no way in the world that Sherrod Brown was going to win Ohio, Sherrod's an old buddy of mine, an old basketball playing buddy of mine from when we were in Congress together. Here's the number to keep in mind. California, okay, bluest state in the country, right? Gavin Newsom gets 59% in his last reelection. Mike DeWine, uncharismatic, sort of short, squatty, workman-like governor of Ohio, Republican, gets 66% of the vote. So there's no way that if Trump performs the way he is in Ohio, that Sherrod Brown's going to have a chance. But, the Pennsylvania race collapsed. The Michigan race collapsed. Suddenly out of the blue, Carrie Lake was really close in Arizona. She obviously didn't prevail in the end. And when I saw those numbers going, I thought there was more than just the Republicans going home, right? That was the trend of where people were moving in the country. And I read lots of stuff about who's left over and undecided voters. Is it 12%, 5%, 3%? You know, we can argue this all night long. But at the end of the day, I think who was left over were Republican-leaning voters who didn't want to vote for Trump. But when they walked into the poll, having had heard Harris talk about national rent control, and piling on grocery stores for their wildly 1.5% margin on peddling cereal and grocery to you and coffee to you. That's where I sort of felt. So towards the end, again, I thought the Democrats would win the House in sort of a protest vote. Republicans won some districts they probably shouldn't have in 2022. I thought the Republicans would get 3 because I thought the 2 were wired in were Montana and clearly West Virginia. And I thought they'd pick up one of the battlegrounds. They ended up picking 2 more. And then, you know, I would vacillate back and forth. At the end of the day, I thought Trump was going to win.
Yeah, I went back and forth the last 2 weeks on almost a daily basis. And I think you're probably right about the concerns about price control comments and, national rent control with like the Never Trumper group or the nominal Republican I don't like Trump group. I think the Democrats, I was about to say they largely voted for Kamala, but a lot of them stayed home. So there were people that were just not enthused about it. With Kamala specifically, I agree with you that I think she had an impossible task in that the election was basically the very last lap of a NASCAR race where you're now pulling over to swap the tires. So the likelihood that you were going to be able to do anything at that point is so minimal that it was a Hail Mary from the beginning. I thought Kamala was a uniquely poor candidate. I'm enjoying the rhetoric of, listen, well, I've seen 2 different things. I've seen one, something to the effect of she did a great job. She ran a great campaign. It's just that it was too late. There was too many factors against her. She should be very, very proud of what she did. That's option 1. Option 2 is, the voters were more bigoted than we thought. And I'm taking option 3, which is I don't think that the voters were bigoted. And also, I don't think she was a strong candidate at any point. I think that she was a fairly weak candidate. And the thing that kind of kept me from going over to her camp, I voted third party. If I'd been in a swing state, I would have voted for Kamala, but I was not enthusiastic enough about her to vote for her in a state where my vote doesn't matter. I went third party because I'd rather vote my conscience. She did not sway me to leave that. I never quite figured out what she actually wanted other than she wanted to be president. I got the message loud and clear that she's not Donald Trump. And if you don't like Donald Trump, you have to pick her as the lesser of 2 evils. Loud and clear, I got that. I broadly agree with it, but I was never enthusiastic about her. I was never excited about her. And my read is I think that if she had complete control of the House and Senate, like 70 votes in the Senate and a supermajority in the House, she'd probably govern very progressively as a California progressive. I think that her ambition was high enough that she would probably do whatever was necessary for her career. So in some sense, that would be very much mitigated by democracy and polling and whatnot. But it was never clear to me so she this kind of saw the light centrist who is going to be governing from the middle as a moderate, or is that just a thing that she's doing right now to get elected and she's willing to capitulate some ground, but really she'd like to be Bernie Sanders if she? It was never made clear to me, and for that reason, I wasn't that excited. And again, I wasn't in a swing state, but apparently my tepid enthusiasm was the same thing everybody else felt because all the folks in the swing states didn't vote for her.
Yeah, so a couple of stories I think that are interesting. So I do a lot of from my podcast Lost in the Middle. I do a lot of radio, and I was on with a Georgia public radio station who I'm sort of their favorite Republican from up north. And it's a black woman host and usually a black science professor from Tennessee State, and then a black male political consultant from Georgia. And we had a call right after Biden stepped down. And the host, Rose, was enthusiastic that it was a chance to elect a black woman. The political science professor was over the moon about how excited she was. And the guy who's a black political consultant said, I don't want to rain on your parade, but remember last time when she tried to run, she did horribly with black men. And I thought one of the weird moments in the campaign is Barack Obama sort of finger scolding yelled at black men that they had an obligation to pay their debt back to the Democratic Party. I got to think for every person that voted for Harris out of that speech, 2 of them voted for Trump because they didn't like being talked to that way. And if you look at Wisconsin, it's interesting. It's not that there were huge swings in Wisconsin, but at the margins, strange things happened. So in 2022, the turnout in Dane County, this was the anti-Dobbs decision vote. The turnout in Dane County was 90% and extraordinarily high Democrats, and on campus in particular. The campus votes were down this time out. In Milwaukee County, there were stories running up to the election that said absentee vote requests, early voting down in the city of Milwaukee itself. That was the story in Pennsylvania, where her deteriorating performance basically cost her Pennsylvania. That in Pennsylvania, they had the same issues going on, because I'm on a Philadelphia talk show host, a talk show on some regular basis. And those were the numbers they were tracking, and they were having a hard time getting folks to the polls. So I think the folks who sort of cast this as, a white Republican sweeping vote, not only did black voters at the margins become a little more Republican, Hispanic voters demonstrably, in a trend that I think is only going to keep accelerating. And interestingly enough, Trump nearly outperformed her with South Asian voters who historically vote Democratic. And now they've got a black South Asian / black woman at the top of the ticket. And they said, no, thank you. So I think anybody who looks at those demographic groups, I also get those speeches all the time from folks talking about immigration and the southern border. And the argument is, well, the reason we don't want them in is because they're brown and black. And it's like, no, the reason we don't want them to come in is it's because illegal all around the world. There are folks sitting today in Ethiopia and Kenya and Azerbaijan and, Sri Lanka and Bhutan and Greenland and Bolivia and every other place you want to circle on the globe, who are waiting to get their permission from the United States State Department and Immigration to move to the United States. So the idea that somehow you're on the southern border and you can sort of jump the queue, I don't think holds water. I mean, I think we've got to keep the system in place. We've always been a nation of immigrants, but it's got to be done in an orderly fashion. And clearly what happened along the southern border is not an orderly fashion. And I think the American public said pretty clearly, knock it off.
Yeah, I'll add, I went down to the border with Justin about 8 months ago, maybe coming up on a year ago. And just from an infrastructure perspective, they've got a really good point. If you're in El Paso or you're you're anywhere along the border, it's not as if people cross the border and then immediately equally distribute throughout the entire country. It's not that people cross the border and then are teleported to Oregon in equal numbers as they are. No, they bottleneck, they pool up along the border. And I have incredible sympathy for people in that. I'm very pro-immigrant. I think we should make it way easier to immigrate into the country at every level. I'm yay immigrant as you come. But if you've got limited municipal resources, you've got limited police resources, you just have a limited amount of cots that are available for people that schlepped across the desert with their kids to escape a cartel, and just strains on sewer systems and things like that. That's a very legitimate perspective to have. And at the very least, there should be some sort of federal largesse to take the pressure off bottleneck moments down on the border. But the people that I talked to, I didn't find people. I mean, everybody I spoke to was basically Hispanic living in America that was second generation. Nobody was saying that, brown people are evil and we want to keep them out. I don't think that was the animating feature. And the polls back me up on that based on everything you're saying with the Hispanic vote, that the Hispanic vote went far more Trump than it had previously and seems to be moving in a Republican direction.
Yeah, and they're more blue, just demographically more blue collar, and they got killed during the COVID shutdown. Right, they couldn't work. I mean, if you were, a fancy pants kid living in Silicon Valley on your computer, life moved on. But if you worked construction jobs, in El Paso or Denver or Duluth, Minnesota, there wasn't any because of the COVID shutdown. Now, we could do 4 podcasts on the COVID response and it was the right thing or the wrong thing. But for those voters, it was very tactile. I mean, they remembered they were out of work, and the person who put them out of work was President Biden. So I think that plays into this as well, too. And it'll be interesting to see if they snap back. I mean, if you look at demographic subgroups all the time, they move and dance around from one election to the next. And you and I have talked a lot about political independence, which is and political orphans, of which I'm from time to time a firm member in that camp. In 12, they voted overwhelmingly for Obama. In 16, they elected Trump. In 20, they moved to Biden. And in this current election, they swung back to Trump again. So it's interesting to sort of watch the march. And the one thing he and I really worry about, and I'm curious about as we move forward, is, again, we talked about this the couple of times I've been lucky enough to be on your podcast, is the huge number of voters today who are registered independents, the largest block in Arizona. It's the largest block in New Hampshire. There's sort of a fancy term there. They're unaffiliated. That was the group who voted for Nikki Haley. You saw a guy with not very much money and not a lot of glitz almost win a Senate race in Nebraska as an independent running against who we all assumed was a popular Republican. So I think as we move forward, that's going to be one thing to track, because I think people are still very frustrated with both parties. At one point, the double haters were up to 24%. I'm not sure the double haters ever went away. They just sort of got to the point where they had to pick somebody, right? Or they're people like a lot of folks I know who just went and voted and wrote somebody's name in because they wouldn't be able to vote for either of them. In fact, Larry Hogan, who ran for Senate and unfortunately lost as a senator from Maryland, said in the last interview he saw he couldn't vote for Harris because he didn't agree with her policies, and he couldn't vote for Trump because he didn't agree with the way he handled themselves and his personal habitats. And I think there were a lot of Americans like that way who ultimately, I think in many cases, walked from the parking lot into the voting center, picked up their ballot and said, I got to vote for somebody. And at the end of the day, more of those last minute people went with Trump.
I would, this would be more of a hassle than it's worth to reform ballot measures in this capacity, but it would be interesting to have a situation where you could vote for Trump in all caps or lowercase. Vote is counted the exact same way, but all you're doing is signaling whether you're excited about it or you're disappointed about it. Same with Kamala. Are you voting all caps Republican where you're enthused, or lowercase where a gun has been put to your head and you feel you have to do this? I think the majority of people are probably in the lowercase scenario. Now, granted, I host the Political Orphanage, and I hang out with a bunch of independents, and I'm basically in the Mos Eisley Cantina with all the libertarians and exiled Republicans. So I'm in a specific demographic where I'm seeing a different side of all of this. But I think the polling does back me out that people are not happy with the Republican Party, the Democratic Party overall. I think they were when the Republican and Democratic parties were really multiple parties that came together every 4 years to pretend to be two parties. But back in the day when Republican kind of meant what you wanted it to mean and Democrat kind of meant what you wanted it to mean, you could find a place in it. You like when I was in Oklahoma in college and I became a Democrat, the line that brought me in was my Democrat friends went, well, I'm not a Democrat. I'm an Oklahoma Democrat.
There you go.
An Oklahoma Democrat's something different. And I'd go, okay, I could be an Oklahoma Democrat. And I could. Like it did fit me. That seems to have disappeared. And my kind of really broad view takeaway of all of that is I think in terms of political institutions right now, we are living in a period most similar to right before World War I. Where, and I don't mean in the sense that a war is about to happen. I certainly hope not. What I mean is that you go back to like 1910, we have electricity, we have airplanes, we have railroads, subways, we have modern technology, and yet the Archduke Franz Ferdinand is the hereditary pseudo-dictator of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. There's a totalitarian monarch running Russia. I think the papal states are still around. Like there's all these weird old feudal institutions that nobody believes in, that nobody has any traction with, but that's what your options are. You're choosing between them. And I look at the current makeup we've got in the United States, and all of the institutions are teeteringly low in terms of trust. That includes both the Republican and Democratic parties, but it includes academia, journalism, government, just kind of across the board. I think that there's a lot of sort of the structural artifice of these institutions, but the functionality of them has altered, and the definitions have not caught up with it yet. And I think we're living in that tail end bit. I hope that whatever comes next will be a good direction, where we get we get a third party that does manage to kind of shake up the electorate and people can find a home in it, and we come up with structural reforms that restore trust in Congress. I hope something like that happens. I'm not convinced that that's going to be what happens, but I suspect that that's part of what's occurring, is that there's just this very low trust and popularity with all institutions, including the Republican and Democratic parties.
Well, and keep in mind, there's a constant realignment in American politics, right? So when I got elected, I served in 8 years in Madison as a Republican, and I was a term limit guy, said no more than 12 years, and I only lasted 8, which will tell you about how fond I was of the job. But, back then, 92, my first reelection, it's George H. Bush and Bill Clinton. Today, George Bush could not get elected in Maine. Bill Clinton would get maybe 28% of the vote if he was lucky in his home congressional district in Arkansas. And so you see these shifts happening. And, one of the tales to be told now is California suddenly had a lot more sort of Republican-leaning turnout. And I don't think that means by any case that California is going to suddenly shift dramatically red. Not going to happen. But, in a congressional delegation with 50 seats plus, Republicans eventually get to 25 again, And the other thing to keep in mind is a number of the traditional Democratic states, California, Illinois, New Jersey, places like that, are losing population. And every time they lose one more member, it means there's one less electoral vote in the Democratic count in each of those states. So that's another interesting thing to watch, because I think, all those folks who moved to Texas and moved out of California and went to Arizona or moved to Idaho or moved to Seattle, wherever they went. So the blue states may be losing some of their clout in the Electoral College just simply because of where we are. But, the one thing I'm glad now is hopefully we're out of this madness where we have to change the Supreme Court rules and add more Supreme Court justices because we don't like the results. We've got to change the elect.
That was goddamn nuts, Scott. Like, I was hearing that from people, and from my perspective, they were going, Trump is a threat to rule of law, as is the Supreme Court, and so we have to pack it. The Supreme Court is a threat to rule of law, so we need to redefine the law to put in people that agree with us. And I was like, so it sounds to me like you want to overturn the autonomy of the Supreme Court because you don't like it, and you're on the side of rule and law. No, sir. That I would be open to having some kind of term limits, grandfather in the existing people, but targeting a new system just to knock out Clarence Thomas is a horrible idea.
Well, and then let's change the Electoral College because that's not fair. It should be a popular vote. Well, now that argument sort of went away. And the other good thing from my perspective is eliminating the filibuster in the Senate is a dangerous trend, right? Because the Senate was always meant to be more deliberative. The House, because you had to stand for election every 2 years, reflected more the hot passions of the people. So, you shouldn't monkey around with sort of fundamental pillars of the U.S. government. And yes, before people email you, and I know the filibuster wasn't around in 1809, okay? But in today's society, I think requiring some super votes in the Senate's not a bad idea. I think monkeying around with the Supreme Court is crazy. If you wanted to change the balance in the Supreme Court, you could have done it in the 60s and 70s when the Democrats always had a supermajority. And then, on all the rest of this, I think. And the one other story that came out in this election that's pretty clear is there were a lot of reformers out there. We sort of had the passion of the early 1900s with Teddy Roosevelt and Robert La Follette, and everybody was all geeked up about Final Five voting or ranked choice voting. Not only did it get enacted in places, it got banned in some. And as we talk, I think it's losing in Alaska, and it may be repealed as part of the Alaskan system. So I think one of the things with electoral reform, they're all worth visiting, but we all need to take our breath because half the time you can create another problem while you're trying to solve a different problem.
That was, I will add, that has not got a lot of traction, but I was very saddened about the electoral reform issues. The only place that decided to enact ranked choice voting is Washington, D.C. Every other jurisdiction that was playing around with ranked choice voting did not. And I'm a big fan. I'm a fan of open primaries, ranked choice voting, electoral reform in general. I'm in favor of, and was generally optimistic about it the last few years, given Alaska, Maine, New York City, and other jurisdictions. So that I think set us back. I would be open, and in fact, I do think we should do Supreme Court reform. But I mean that in the sense that I want it to be systemic rather than targeted. So I do Judge Week on the Political Orphanage every year, where we go over Supreme Court decisions, and I like the Republican-appointed justices maybe 60 to 70% of the time. I have some real serious deviations from them on a regular basis, but overall, though, I like them generally. And so as somebody that largely likes the Republican Supreme Court picks, I could see this going the other way, where for 40, 45 years, it's just, three people that I agree with, while there's six people that disagree with me. So I don't want to target anybody or kick anybody out, but I wouldn't mind having some kind of changes to just make it less pivotal from election to election. Like the simplest thing I would do is just every president, when they come in, they get to appoint one Supreme Court justice. As long as they're like there's always a minimum of 9, but there's up to 20. And so just know that every time there's an election, a new Supreme Court justice gets added. That way it kind of takes out that apocalyptic, like checking on Ruth Bader Ginsburg's health on a daily basis, like seeing what her sodium levels are, because that's going to affect national policy. So I would be up for changing some of those things. But again, that's very different to me than I don't like this court and I want to change the composition in order to get the court I want. That's just messing with judicial autonomy, which I don't want to do. We'll wrap up here in a second, Scott. I mentioned at the beginning of the episode that I was like a 6 or a 7 in 2016 when Trump got elected in terms of apoplexy. I'm now like a 4. So I don't think it's good. I am frustrated and disappointed, but it's more or less within the normal parameters of me just being disappointed with an election now. I'm curious where you are. Scale of 1 to 10. Are you like, are you sending your kids gold and getting fake passports to Bermuda? Are you on Trump's hit list? Where are you at?
My only disappointment is that the House didn't become Democratic, only because I prefer divided government. And I think anytime you control all the levers, it makes for mischief, and some of the mice come scurrying up from the basement. So but I also don't believe this whole thing that suddenly American democracy is going to fall. I mean, for God's sakes, there was violence when we got founded. I mean, anybody listening who's seen that play Hamilton, how it goes, the Supreme Court. Teddy Roosevelt almost got shot, my favorite president. We survived Vietnam and World War II and the Korean War and the Cold War and lots of other stuff. I think the country's going to be just fine. And we go through Trump, I think, is just sort of an interesting transitional figure. I think that in many ways, Reagan transformed the Republican Party in a way that stuck for probably 3 decades. I'm not sure when the moment that Donald Trump walks out the door, I'm not sure what follows him, but I don't think it'll be another Donald Trump-like Republican.
Yeah. All right. Great. Well, Scott, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. I'm glad we were able to confer after the election. Once again, the name of your podcast.
Lost in the Middle, America's Political Orphans, wherever you can find the place. And it was great to have Justin on the show for a while. He had a little bit of a conflict, so I'm bummed he had to leave early. But as always, it's great to talk to both of you.
Yeah, and on my end, for Scott's listeners, I'm Andrew Heaton, and I host the Political Orphanage. So a lot of overlap there. And good to talk to you, Scott.
Yeah, and listen, he's a lot funnier than I am, which isn't a big high bar, Andrew.
Here's the team behind Lost in the Middle. Executive producer Jeff Mayers. Producer Todd Elbaugh. Creative team Claudia Luz and Tony Wood. Edited by Aaron Zummers. Music by Brett William. Production at Civic Media. And a quick thanks to our partners at the American Property Owners Alliance. If you like this episode of Lost in the Middle, please remember to subscribe to our podcast. And if you enjoyed it, please tell your friends and pals.